Inside the stories that affect you. This is Inside KELOLAND.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Since the George Floyd death and following protests worldwide, we here at KELOLAND are trying to continue the conversation on race relations and what we all can do to improve the treatment of others. Tonight, we're talking with community members on the issues that need to be addressed. But first, you're familiar with Independence Day on 4th of July, but there's also Freedom Day for African Americans that just happened a few days ago. Friday was Juneteenth. It refers to the day back in 1865 when Union troops in Texas informed the last group of enslaved African Americans that they were finally free. Those slaves didn't know that President Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation more than 2 years earlier, freeing all slaves in the South. And this year's celebration in Sioux Falls started with a proclamation signing at City Hall.
Do hereby proclaim June 19, 2020.
Mayor Paul Tenhaken issued a proclamation celebrating the historical and social significance of Juneteenth.
Juneteenth to me means a day where we can, celebrate with people of color in our community on a very special day.
The ongoing protests calling for racial justice and equality in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd has placed Juneteenth in the national consciousness.
All the marches that we've had today, also in our community, all over the country, it's an uprising. So it's a big awareness of what's going on.
Juneteenth is still hazy history to a lot of South Dakotans. Mayor Paul Tenhaken admits he didn't know much about the holiday until after he took office.
I'll plead ignorance to that until I got in this chair, and it was one of the first proclamations I did after I became mayor, and learned how it was the true emancipation of slavery.
But a once little-known holiday can be a catalyst for progress on racial issues by reminding everyone that the past helps shape our future.
And it's not just an African American holiday or a people of color holiday. We should all be celebrating our liberties and justice.
Governor Kristi Noem also proclaimed this past Friday as Juneteenth Day in the state of South Dakota. Well, as people fight for change, we're continuing the conversation. Joining us via Zoom tonight to discuss the improvements needed in race relations are local law enforcement officer Julian Baudouin and business owner J.J. Johnson. Thanks for joining us for Inside KELOLAND.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I think for starters, I want to ask each of you, maybe we'll start with you, Julian, what does Juneteenth mean to you?
Juneteenth really signifies to me our liberations. And we know even present day, the things that we're fighting for, we're still fighting for our freedoms. When Juneteenth was given to the slaves, it was given as a right of freedom to move the way you want to move, to own the things you want to own, to do the things that are necessary for African Americans to move just as free as anyone else in our country. And we're still fighting for those rights. So it signifies a day of liberation, but I don't want anybody to think that we're there yet. We still have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people, we just saw Mayor Paul Tenhaken say that he didn't know much about Juneteenth before he became mayor. Do you find that to be the case? A lot of people just aren't up to the history of Juneteenth?
Yeah, one of the reasons why I believe Juneteenth is not well known is because it's not really taught in our school system. With that being a key part of African American history, one of the things that we really try to hone in on in the Black community is that African American history is every bit a part of American history as anything else. And so that is something that I believe we should be teaching in our school system.
Mm-hmm. JJ, I'm going to ask you the same question. What does Juneteenth mean to you?
Family time, hanging out with community members. And it's also a great opportunity to teach and educate people. It's a great opportunity to brush up on some Black history. I do think that some Americans may view it as an unpatriotic holiday if you substitute 4th of July for Juneteenth, but it's really actually the opposite. It's the most American holiday that I can think of. And I just am happy that it's getting a lot of recognition now.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the state of South Dakota should permanently recognize Juneteenth as an official holiday?
I think that's a great step in the right direction and a great outward sign of inclusion that the state of South Dakota can do for the people here, for sure.
Mm-hmm. JJ, give us an idea about your business background now. You're a young entrepreneur. You started your own digital marketing company. Tell us about that.
Yes, I own a digital marketing company in Sioux Falls where we help small businesses and also people that have personal brands spread their message on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We create content, we manage communities, and we help local potential city council members like Julian help run his campaign too. So we love what we do. We get to be creative every day. We get to meet and talk with people every day, whether it's online or in person. I really got a good gig going on.
What's it like starting a business in Sioux Falls?
You know, I've lived in bigger cities like Minneapolis, Houston, Los Angeles, and I can say hands down the camaraderie that I've felt, the mentoring that's available here, the economy, all of that has been fundamental in helping me grow a business, to help take care of my family, to help employ other people. I honestly don't feel like it would have worked anywhere else for me.
Mm-hmm. And Julian, give us an idea about your law enforcement background.
So I've been in law enforcement now for 10 years, and I work for the state of South Dakota. And really and truly, one of the things that I really wanted to do was go into the military. I didn't have the opportunity to do so because a physical. I actually failed my physical to go into the military. So I looked at a career in law enforcement, and I've been in love with it ever since.
Mm-hmm. What do you like about it?
You know, what I love the job that I do. And what I love about it really is it gives me the opportunity to meet community members, but more than that, it gives me the opportunity to be present in front of the youth in our community, so that they have the representation that they need and they see that they can succeed in anything they want to do.
Mm-hmm. So you see yourself as a mentor and a role model for a lot of for young children.
Yeah, I hope to. I try my very best to do what's right all the time, make the right decisions, but also be very present. I'm very intentional about being present in the community. Very intentional about being present around the youth in the community, so that they can see the things that I'm doing, see the moves that I'm making here in Sioux Falls, and maybe potentially be in a role of leadership themselves one day.
Okay. Well, we're going to be taking a quick break. Stay with us inside KELOLAND. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. It's been 1 week since protesters returned to the streets of Sioux Falls to draw attention to racial injustice in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The protesters gathered along Minnesota Avenue calling for an end to police brutality and racism. The protesters included people of all ages, but some of the strongest voices belong to young people who want to see lasting and meaningful change.
I was at the last one, the first one here, and it's time. You know, people's voices need to be heard. We need to get our voices out here. A lot of change needs to come for what we're doing. Small steps to a bigger goal. That's how I like to say it.
Bolden says the strong turnout for the event shows that young people in Sioux Falls are paying attention to national issues involving race. And we continue now our conversation with Julian Baudouin and business owner J.J. Johnson via Zoom. Thanks for joining us for Inside KELOLAND. Julian, we want to talk to you first of all. Are you surprised at the strong interest in the rallies and the protests here in Sioux Falls?
Yeah, you know, these protests really that we've been having, and I prefer to really refer to them as protests and not rallies, because for years we've been putting out a rallying cry, and now that cry has been heard. It's been heard by the community, and the community has showed a lot of support, a ton of support for Black people here directly in our city. And so we expected, during the organization of that protest, we expected maybe 40 or 50 people originally. Then the numbers started to grow to where we thought maybe a few hundred people would turn out, and turned out to be about 4,000 to 5,000 individuals who showed up. And so it was very, very encouraging to see the unity and the peace and the love surrounding the Black community here in Sioux Falls.
And you spoke at that very first protest in Sioux Falls.
I did, yes.
And it was a pretty emotional time for you. Why is that?
Yeah, just being a representation of law enforcement, but also being a representation of the Black community, sometimes can be an internal struggle. And so it was never any more present than at that time. And so the speech that I gave, was really me as a human being coming out to tell my story, and how I am affected by this killing as well. But not only that, it was also an opportunity for us in law enforcement to stand up for what's right. And so me as a law enforcement officer, seeing that video, I knew that there was an injustice, and I could not be silent in that moment.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to be talking about police policy in a little later in this show. JJ, you were also at that earlier rally too. What were your thoughts about that?
I'd say just the collective energy that I felt, and being surrounded by so many people with the same vision. It was incredible. I thought the speakers that spoke at the protest were articulate, and it was incredible. And I'm just really excited to see how the community can mobilize now and see where this goes.
Yeah, where do you see this going? Is the momentum just going to continue, do you think?
I do think it is going to continue. I think it's an up-road battle. We know that systematic racism is almost ingrained into our culture here in America, and it will take a lot of progressive leaders to change that. But I am a person that has tremendous optimism. So I am optimistic about what's going to happen in Sioux Falls, especially.
Mm-hmm. And you were born and raised in Sioux Falls, JJ. What was that like for you growing up in Sioux Falls?
I would say overall, my experience here was incredible experience. But at the same token, I was a victim of racism at a very young age. The first time I was brought up hearing a negative slur about race was when I was 5 years old in kindergarten. There was a situation in grade school where I'd colored Jesus black, and I got reprimanded for that. And those may seem like small things in the moment, but what I've come to later find out that those were actually very big deals for me growing up, and I carried it along with me. So now moving back to Sioux Falls and being in the community, I hope that I can help other biracial Black girls to love themselves, love their hair, and things like that. But it was really great growing up here for sure.
But you moved out of Sioux Falls to go to a more diverse community. Tell us about that.
Right out of high school, I went to the nearest big city that I could find, which was Minneapolis, because I was just thirsty for culture. I was thirsty for diversity, art, and I had to leave. And coming back 3 years ago, after being gone for maybe 12 years, it was refreshing to see kind of how the city has changed and evolved since I've been gone. So I feel like we're on the right track. I know I need to be patient. I wish the process would go faster, but there's definitely been positive change.
Okay. Well, we're going to take another quick break. Stay with us inside KELOLAND. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The call for police policy reform continues all across the country following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. In light of that incident and the violence and protests that have followed, the Sioux Falls Police Department reviewed its policies, including the use of force and arrest protocols.
To show why we do what we do and how what happened in Minneapolis is not part of our policy. We don't train that.
Chief Burns says chokeholds and strangleholds are not trained by their department either. Now, take a closer look at the police department's policies. We've attached a link under this story at KELOLAND.com. Now, we are continuing the conversation on race relations with local business owner J.J. Johnson and law enforcement officer Julie Boudouin. Julian, let's talk about what we just heard the Sioux Falls Police talking about regarding their reviews of policies. And there's some disagreement within the African-American community about law enforcement not doing enough in that regard. Talk about that, Julian.
Yeah, so one of the struggles, or one of the things that has really caused a distrust between the African American community and law enforcement agencies across the nation really has been the fact that police agencies seem to always police themselves. And so, what we would really like to see is some type of citizen review board. And I say we, meaning the African American community here. Of course, I represent both. But when I take the uniform off, I'm still a Black man in America. And so, allowing a citizen review board to come into place to review the policies to ensure that they're all equitable, all of those policies are equitable for all people in our community is extremely important and will benefit the community greatly.
How prevalent in your eyes do you see racism in the city of Sioux Falls?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
How prevalent is racism addressed to you specifically in Sioux Falls? When you take that uniform off, I would imagine you see that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In uniform, it's great because nobody's ever seen a Black cop before. I'm one of only two Black officers in the organization that I work for across the entire state. As a matter of fact, sometimes I'll stop at gas stations. People will pay for my food. People will pay for my drinks. People ask to take pictures with me because they've never seen a Black man in law enforcement in South Dakota. And so those things are great. But as soon as you take the uniform off, you get glares. I don't dress like a cop. I don't look like a cop when I'm off duty. And so you get the glares, you get the stares. You get the people in my own neighborhood maybe even walking across the street because they don't want to be near me, even when they know what I do. But those are some of the things that we experience on a day-to-day basis. However, when we talk about systematic racism, those are things that are long-term. Those are things that are systems that need to be broken down, and those are things that maybe we don't see on a day-to-day basis, but it affects us day-to-day.
Mm-hmm. Another big issue that law enforcement is dealing with in cities across the country is the term defunding police. What does that mean, and what does that mean for departments across the country?
Yeah, so just to be clear, there's two different conversations that are happening across America. There's the defunding conversation, and then there's the abolishing of the police department conversation. And to be clear, I am not in favor of the abolishing of the police department conversation. I am in favor of defunding. And what that means specifically is just reallocating funds within the public safety realm to bring those funds back to the community. Maybe even limit the amount of call for services by the police department, limiting the amount of risk that the police department has with the community, and therefore, of course, limiting the risk of our community members being shot and killed.
Mm-hmm. JJ, I want to get an idea from you. What do you think about more community involvement in police procedures and protocols?
Great question. I actually just watched an interview with another young Black gentleman who was a police officer on the East Coast, and he said something that really stood out, and I really sat and chewed on it all day today. And he said, 80% of my work that I do is social work, and I only do around 20% police work. So that really put into my brain the actual work that police officers are doing is maybe they're not 100% equipped to deal with a lot of the social problems that they're called on for. And I think that's something that we need to address and look into deeper. I think a citizen board is a great idea. I think accountability is great. That's how I achieve a lot of my goals, is having accountability partners. So yes, I'm all for that for sure.
Julian, how do you give the public confidence, especially minorities in the community, that law enforcement is on their side?
Well, that's a tough question to even answer because the distrust with law enforcement and the African American community has been around since really the beginning of our freedom. We talked about Jubilee Day and Juneteenth, and we know that the original police departments were created as slave catchers. But then we also know, going back in history, that our what we call now modern day policing was really created as a system in the 1940s and 1950s to combat the civil rights movement. And so what we face now is really more what I said earlier, a systematic approach to racism versus just the overt racism. That system was created in the 40s and 50s really to harm African Americans in our nation, and we're still seeing the effects of that now. And so we won't see really a trust built between those two, in my opinion, until we tear down the system that's in place and we rebuild it for our community that best fits Sioux Falls.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a quick break. Inside KELOLAND, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside KELOLAND. We're continuing our discussion on race in KELOLAND. J.J. Johnson, wanted to talk to you a little bit about the violence we saw at an earlier protest in Sioux Falls at the Empire Mall. What were your thoughts about that?
It was a little upsetting because we had such a powerful movement earlier in that day, but it's understandable from the perspective of a person that is hurting deeply. Usually these riots happen because of years and years and years of unjust things happening to a person. So I think that we need to just wrap our arms around our youth and the people that are hurting in the community and really get down to the root of what these issues are.
Mm-hmm. Are you concerned that we may see more violence during protests in Sioux Falls?
I'm unsure of that. I'm not a big worrier, so I tend to not try to worry about things, but I do know that if there aren't changes that are going to happen, that people are going to continue to become upset, and the potential of rioting is always a part of that. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. And Julian, as a law enforcement officer, you responded to that scene at the Empire that night. What was it like responding to the riot?
Yeah, honestly, I don't get too nervous in situations, especially in law enforcement, but I was just coming off the peaceful march that we had, and I had an emotional speech there, and I just knew that when I went there, something was going to happen to me, and so I was nervous, number one. But then at the same time, I had to make sure that I understood. One thing that my grandmother used to always tell me is that if you back a dog in the corner, it's going to come out fighting. And so I really did understand that we have in the Black community had over 400 years of oppression, whether it's physically, verbally, or systematic oppression. We've had that. And so now this particular generation is coming out and saying we won't have that anymore. So I understood where their anger and their rage was coming from. And for me, now is the time to really harness in that anger and that energy, and let's see what we can do to move forward as a community.
Did you feel that you were personally targeted that night?
No, I was not personally targeted that night. I was with a group of other law enforcement officers, and the group that I was in, none of us were personally targeted.
Mm-hmm. But are you worried that we could see something like that again in the future?
Just like JJ said, if the oppression continues, I wouldn't put it past the community to do so. A voice not only has to be heard, it has to be recognized. Mm-hmm. And then it also has to be understood, and there has to be movement and action to make sure that there are changes. So if we continue to see the same systematic oppression that we have over the past 400 plus years, it will absolutely happen.
Okay. Well, thank you both for joining us for Inside KELOLAND for a very interesting discussion. And you can find out more about today's topics online at KELOLAND.com. Just click on the Inside KELOLAND section. Be sure to join us again next week for more of what's going on inside KELOLAND.